good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Leader Camp brought to you by Skillsoft and People Matters. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual 2-day workshop. I'm Yasmin Taj, Managing Editor with People Matters, and it is my privilege to be your host for the day. I hope you all had a great time going through the platform and through the pre-reads. I'd like to thank each one of you for taking out time to join us for this exclusive program that we have curated especially for you. Equality says everyone is treated the same here. With this leader camp, we will be focusing on working towards an equitable future. The assumption that everyone is treated the same based on their skills can hamper the organization's and leadership's capacity to be critical of the systems, policies, and practices that need a change for everyone to experience a fair and inclusive work culture. Equity is truly the capstone of the journey through diversity, inclusion, and equality. And the best part about achieving equity is the unique and intangible sense of community and engagement it creates. And to help create an equitable and hence an equal workplace, People Matters and Skillsoft bring to you this Leader Cap, which is a live, online, instructor-led and interactive learning experience. I would also like to thank the entire Skillsoft team for helping us put this program together. Their expertise in this domain has helped us create the right agenda for this 2-day program. We have an exciting agenda planned ahead of us. Let me quickly take you through the flow for the day. On the first day, we will talk about advancing DE&I efforts that create an impact. In this session, you will get an opportunity to learn to assess and include D&I big rocks into business planning, establish goals and accountability with KPI-driven D&I targets, write tools and strategy to promote more women into leadership roles, reorganize teams that work to facilitate gender-balanced organizations. We will be starting with a session on advancing D&I efforts that create an impact by Elissa M. Vincent, Vice President, Global Talent Enablement, Skillsoft. Elissa has around 21 years of experience leading human capital management, learning and development, talent management, organization design, and diversity and inclusion teams in global organizations. Now at Skillsoft, she leads the efforts to enable the individual and collective success of employees and leaders. With that, our next guest speaker for today's session will be Tina Vinod, Head DE&I at ThoughtWorks, a feminist at heart with a strong belief that an inclusive organizational culture brings about the best in teams and individuals. Tina drives the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Charter at ThoughtWorks. This includes the DEI strategy and long-term vision. Her areas of focus include women in tech, social inclusion, support and solidarity to the LGBTQI community, building a culture of inclusion and belonging, and disability inclusion. Welcome, Melissa. Welcome, Tina. Thank you so much for joining us for this Leader Camp today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here with all of you today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tina, for joining us too.
Thank you so much for having me here. And I love the topic, and I'm really looking forward to some exciting conversations.
Absolutely, same here. So without any further delay, I would now like to request Elissa to take it from here. And I'll also like to request all of you to please keep posting your questions and comments in the chat section. We will be taking all your questions towards the end of the session today. And this will help us interact with each other better. So keep posting, everyone. So with that, over to you, Elissa. Looking forward to some great insights from you.
Great. Thank you so much. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. As Yasmin said, we want this to be an extremely interactive leader camp today. So please, throughout the session, I'll be asking you questions. Share your experiences in the chat pod, share your stories with us, your perspectives with us. We firmly believe here at Skillsoft and People Matters that we can learn often as much from each other as you can learn from me and Tina here today. So we are going to be talking about advancing DEI for impact in your organizations as leaders in an organization, regardless of your level, regardless of whether or not you're a leader of self or a leader of others. We have an amazing opportunity right now to be part of a global movement around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We all know, and we have all experienced, that this global pandemic, which we are still in many parts of the world very much in the midst of, has had an impact on marginalized communities, populations, employees, friends, family members, so much more than any type of experience that we have all had in our collective history. And so now is the time where many organizations, many leaders, many thought leaders, and each and every one of us have an opportunity to hold on to the renewed sense of energy and purpose on this topic and to create sustainable change. And so, what I'm going to be talking about today as we kick off this leader camp, day one of your experience. And remember, we have a whole day two planned also with some amazing insights from two of my colleagues, as well as a panel of esteemed experts. I'm going to be focusing specifically on what is all of this that we are talking about. So when we talk about DEI, when we talk about this work, when we talk about how it is applied to leadership, when we talk about the impact that this pandemic and that we currently have economically and socially on many communities in the world, specifically women in the workplace, I am reminded always before I kick any of these topics off and we talk about these types of initiatives and goals and challenges that we have, of a quote by a famous poet in the United States called Maya Angelou. I don't know how many of you have seen this quote before or have heard of Maya Angelou before, but whenever we talk about leadership, this rings in my ears and I use it all the time. People will forget what you say, people will forget what you do, but they will never forget how you made them feel. So people will forget often what you say. They may forget what it is that you do for them, with them, but they will never forget how in your presence at any given moment, you made them feel, you helped them feel. And for all of us that work in space, right, who work in talent or DEI or human resources or any type of support, whether we're selling products and services that benefit humans, people, which is what most of us do. This is true even for our products and services. Someone may forget what it is that they bought from you. Someone may forget what it is, the details of that interaction. But people will never forget how they felt in your store, working with your organization, that one-on-one connection with someone else. Whenever we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, I remember this, and I want us all to remember this, that so much of what we're going to talk about today involves a feeling, an experience that we're trying to create and sustain in each of our organizations. And so I'm going to be covering 4 topics before I hand it over to Tina for her to share what it is that we're doing in this space at an organizational level, for her to share some metrics and KPIs, how we can measure this work. So first, I want to start us off with what is it that we're talking about here today? There's so much talk and buzz around the world about DEI. Well, what does DEI stand for? And what's this B that we're all talking about, right? When we talk about belonging. Then I want to explore the multiple dimensions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are the different pieces and the different lenses that we need to be looking at as organizational leaders? Before we even think about how we can target and assist and ensure diverse pipelines of talent in our organizations, we first need to be able to define it, see what it looks like, and understand the multiple dimensions that we're going to be talking about and building on in this 2-day journey. Then I want to talk about considering cultural connectivity. What does it mean to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the lens of organizational culture? And then we'll spend time talking about the top 3 priorities for DEI for leaders in all organizations. Regardless of what your top goals and priorities are as an organization, as a leader for your teams, here are some things that each and every single one of us can do to prioritize this work for ourselves and for each other in our workplaces. I'm going to be pausing throughout the session today to ask questions. So please, again, share your experiences in the chat pod, share any questions that you might have. We have the People Matters team that will be answering those questions, but also Tina and I will have a dialogue and a discussion back and forth with some questions that we have together on how we can continue to grow this work. And then also we'll be opening it up to all of you to ask us questions towards the end of the Leader Camp today. So again, please, let's keep this as interactive as possible. And I will make sure to try to look at the chat pod so that I can hear your comments as well and be able to respond to those as we go. So defining diversity, equity, and inclusion. About 5 years ago, the acronym that we used for this work was diversity and inclusion. Recently, we've inserted this new word called equity. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are facts and there are feelings. Whenever we talk about this topic, it seems to be shrouded in this cloud of wonder. What is this? What are we talking about exactly? What are our KPIs? What should we be worried and concerned about? What is important for organizational leaders to know, team leaders to know, frontline managers to know on all of this? How is any of this work different than just unconscious bias or implicit bias training? How do we break it down? Well, let's demystify diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are facts and there are feelings. The facts are organizations we know perform better when they have diverse teams, when they have diverse individuals leading executives in the organization, when they have diversity across their succession plans and in their pipelines. Organizations that are the most innovative, that have cultures of inclusion, are ones where people can disagree in a healthy way, where people can generate ideas consistently, where people can iterate on concepts, where people can have conversations with their customers, with their partners, with all within their ecosystem. So there are facts about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and there are feelings. How do I feel working for this organization? How do I feel interacting with my leaders? How do I, as a leader, feel about the support that I'm getting from my teams? How easy is it for me to recruit diverse talent on my teams? I might want to, but how easy is it for me to do so? Where can I find those resources? Where can I find that support? So there are feelings and then there are facts. And so today, Tina and I are going to make sure that we talk about both the facts and then the feelings that we can generate as we try to build these cultures of inclusions and diverse pipelines in our organizations. So we talk often about this concept of intersectionality. And before I go any further, I want to talk about what that means. So when we think about the dimensions of diversity, we think about intersectionality. What intersectionality really means is that we as humans, as people, are more than just one thing. I'm more than just a woman. I'm a white woman. I'm a mother. I'm a daughter. I'm a first generation immigrant in the United States. I'm a first generation college attendee. And there are parts of me that you can see because you look at me physically. And there are parts of me that are of equal importance in my identity and my experience and my perceptions and perspectives that you cannot see. So intersectionality means that that all of us have many different intersectional points. There are many different dimensions to who we are. So when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and we look to enable this work in our organizations and on our teams and our communities, we have to first acknowledge that who we are and how we identify matters, that there are many elements of people's diversity that we cannot see. There are many elements of people's diversity that we can see, and we have to be careful not to make assumptions. We have to always question and assess our biases. But when we're thinking about specifically programs in our organizations that we can lead and that we can run, we need to be able to open them up enough so that people feel comfortable enough speaking about the multiple dimensions of who they are. And so before we go into any of these spaces and we think about the systemic advantages that some people have and the systemic disadvantages that some people have, that analysis of who we are, and when we think about DEI, the parts that you can see of me and the parts of me that you can't see and you might not know about, as leaders, we need to dial into those feelings of curiosity, of empathy, of being inquisitive, wanting to know more about people, and being able to embody those for the people that we lead in our organizations, in our communities, and in our families. What is it about you that I don't know that I want to learn through your stories? So how many of you have ever felt like you've been in a situation where you have been the other? And you can chat in the chat pod if you want to share your experiences or just think about it and reflect about it. Situations where you have felt like I am different than everybody else in this particular group at this particular time. I once participated in a workshop, a DEI workshop that was led by a CEO of a company. He identified as a white, cisgendered, heterosexual man who had grown up with privilege. And he was talking about the phenomenal work that he had been leading in his organization around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he opened up his talk by saying, I'm the least diverse person in this room, or at least I thought. And he talked about a time where he has Italian American roots, and he was participating in a CEO executive forum. And he had walked into the room and he had on an article of clothing that identified him as an Italian American. And when he walked into the room, he had been told that this was a casual event, and everybody else was dressed in their business uniform and clothes, and he was not. And so he had an opportunity at that very moment. He was taken aback. People were making comments. He felt excluded. He felt like he was the other in that particular moment. The discomfort that he felt, the lack of confidence that he felt in that moment, even though he knew these people, that one moment, that one experience, it only lasted for 5 minutes, and he acknowledged how lucky he was that instead of a lifetime of feeling like he was the other, it lasted 5 minutes, gave him the awareness and the perspective of what this must feel like when it is a lifetime of feeling, as we say, othered. And that was inspiration enough for him to say, there are things I don't know. There are things I was not aware of. And this experience has ignited new passion in me. And so I see some of you talking about, so how do you do this? So how do you create these experiences so that we become more and more aware of this? There are ways, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, for us as organizations to be able to bring that level of awareness and for us to seek those moments of awareness in our own lives as we look to lead this work. So thank you for sharing your stories as well in the chat pod. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, what are they? So diversity is the presence of difference that may include race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, nationality, socioeconomic status, language, ability, disability, age, religion, political perspective. Diversity is the facts. It is who you are. It is what makes you who you are. Equity is something in addition to that. Equity is about promoting justice. It's about impartiality and fairness within the procedures, processes, distribution of resources, of institutions, organizations, and of systems that make up those institutions and organizations. So tackling equity issues requires an understanding of a root cause of what's getting in the way from diverse populations in an organization and throughout our society. What are those disparities in how we do what we do that are creating issues for people in our societies and in our workplaces? So diversity is a fact. Equity is about fairness and justice within an organization. So we often talk about equity in terms of pay equity. Inclusion is an act. It is something more than that. Inclusion is an outcome of ensuring that those who identify as diverse actually feel and are welcomed. So they feel welcomed in an organization. Inclusion outcomes are met when you, your institution, your program are all targeted and truly inviting all allies, members of diverse communities. To the degree to which diverse individuals are able to participate fully in the decision-making processes, development opportunities within an organization or a group. So inclusion is an act, right? Belonging, which is this next word that we hear a lot about in our organizations, is the feeling of being part of something and mattering to others. We create it through inclusion, which consists of intentional acts. Employees don't need to be popular or liked by everyone, but we do need to feel that what we are doing in our organizations brings inherent value. And I think all of us can identify with that, right? I want to know that what I am doing is important, that it is valued, and that I have a sense that I belong here, that my strengths, my talents that are unique to me are valued here, and that I belong. Belonging is an outcome. It is when we are diverse and equitable and inclusive. Our employees and all of us feel like we belong. It is an outcome of holding the space where everyone truly feels empowered to speak up, be part of change, and make a shift in culture. And it is the responsibility of those of us in leadership and of dominant social cultures to create these conditions. So if we're going to use an analogy, we would say that diversity is a dance. Inclusion is being invited to, is a party, right? Diversity is that party. It's that dance that you're hoping to get invited to. Inclusion is being invited to that. Equity is ensuring that every person at that party has equal access, equitable access to the dance floor. And belonging is that feeling that you can dance however you want to dance. So we can't really get into how do we do this work without defining what it is that we're talking about. And what is the difference between equity and equality? We talk about this all the time. We have spent years of our lives talking about, well, equal treatment for everyone. Well, equity and equality are two different things. Equality means that each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. Equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances. And when we're equitable, we allocate the exact resources and opportunities needed by each individual. Instead of saying, you all get the same thing, which is equal treatment, you get what you need, and you get what you need, and I get what I need, is equity. Equity, if we believe that equity is important in our organizations, what we are saying to ourselves, what we are saying to our customers and to our shareholders and to our stakeholders across our ecosystems, is that we believe that we can invest and take care of those in our organization that need us the most. And that doesn't mean that we are taking away anything from anyone else. Equality is I'm giving the same thing to everyone. Equity is I'm able to individualize the experience and see that you may need more than me at this time. And because I give something to you, that doesn't mean that you are taking something away from me. And so equity is an entirely new lens for organizations to have to think about how they can resource this work, be thoughtful and creative about how they can recruit and retain and sponsor women in the workplace, people of color in the workplace, members of the LGBTQ plus in the community in the workplace, people with disabilities, neurodiversity in the workplace, and so on. So diversity is, again, understanding all of those intersectional, appreciating all of those intersectional points, interwoven points of our identities, and then focusing on those populations that need us to focus on them the most. So right now, when we think about the impact that this global pandemic has had on women in the workplace, and you'll hear more and more about that tomorrow, specifically when we talk about allyship and inclusion, inclusive leadership. What does it mean for us to be able to focus specifically on the recruitment and advancement of women in our organizations to make up for the loss of women in the workplace that we've had because women have had to stay home to care for children and sick family members, more so than men in similar roles across organizations? So we'll talk more about that, and we will also invest a lot of time talking about that tomorrow. But there is a difference here. And so when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and Tina will talk more and more about that in her section as well, we're looking at equity, which is fairness. Equality is still important, but equity right now is the name of the game. If we're going to make and have a strategic impact in our organizations, we need to think about how can I make sure that all of the opportunities that I'm providing to my team members are equitable. All of the systems and processes and programs and access that we're providing in our organizations is equitable. So in May of 2020, McKinsey released a report called Diversity Wins: How Inclusion Matters. They did a study of about 15 countries and 1,000 large businesses. The business case for DEI, they found, has never been stronger. And I would argue that especially during this global pandemic, the human case for DEI has never been stronger. Yes, numbers are important. Yes, making the business case is important. But also there's a human case to this as well, which is that these are the right things to do. These are the things that we need to do to ensure our success as organizations, as societies, all of it. So what they found in this study was fascinating. For the 3 indicators of inclusion, so equity, equality, openness, belonging, they found particularly high levels of negative sentiment about equality and fairness of opportunity, so equality and inequity. Negative sentiment specifically on equality ranged from 63 to 80% across the industries analyzed. The work environment's openness, which encompasses bias, discrimination, was also a significant concern. Negative sentiment across industries ranged from 38% to 56% when we talk about openness, bias, and discrimination. Now, belonging, this concept of belonging, however, elicited an overall positive sentiment, but from a relatively small number of mentions. So when they did this large global study and they talked about these concepts, respondents returned with this feeling about these terms and about this work in their organizations. So I want you to pause for just a moment and think about that, right? Think about when I hear these words, what feelings do these words evoke in me? What are the first things that I think of? And those biases that we have, and we all know that our biases are natural, right? If we have brains, we have a bias. It's what we do with those biases and how quickly we overcome them that matters. That is the muscle that we need to build throughout our lives, right? Is to be able to constantly become more and more aware of the biases that we carry and watch and monitor how we use them, show up with them, and how we can silence them and eradicate them in our own lives with the more awareness that we have. So what is so interesting to me about this study is that even these words elicit a particular feeling and an experience from people. And so what did they recommend at McKinsey? Well, here's what they recommended, and then I'll share in just a moment what it is that I think we need to be focused on that builds on this. So they recommended 2 things from this study that they observed. And again, this was global from 15 countries across the world. And if you want to learn more, McKinsey has that study that they offer online publicly to all. The first one is systemic business-led approach to inclusion, diversity are important. So what does it mean to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion from the individual perspective, but also from the systemic perspective, from the people perspective, but also the systems and processes that support everything that we do? Are those equitable? Are those inclusive? And 2 is to create bold steps to strengthen inclusion. So what they say here, five tactics: increase diverse representation in your organization, particularly in leadership and critical roles. Are we going out in the world and looking for diverse talent? Are we taking the easy way out and saying, well, I know this person would be good at it, and so they're very similar to me, so I'll hire that person? How are we recruiting diverse talent in our organizations? And what are we doing to make sure that we're doing it in an equitable way and that we're giving ourselves enough time to be able to do it? Strengthen leadership and accountability for delivering I&D goals. What that means is that we are measuring this type of leadership capability in all of our leaders in an organization through regular performance reviews and feedback. Do we have diversity, equity, and inclusion as pillars and leadership competencies that we are regularly assessing, supporting, providing feedback on, and holding our leaders accountable for? That we're ensuring equality of opportunity through fairness and transparency, that we're promoting openness, tackling bias and discrimination, and that we foster belonging through support for multivariant diversity. And what they mean by that is all diversity across the spectrum that we just mentioned before. So there's a comment here that I think is extremely important. I just want to read it from the chat box here. If leadership doesn't own this agenda, it is very difficult to create the right culture and environment for creating impact. Yes, absolutely. 100%. This is something that we as leaders in organizations need to hold each other accountable for. We as individual contributors, if we are individual contributors, can hold our leaders accountable for. But all of us have an opportunity to ignite change in our organizations and to inspire and hold others and ourselves accountable. So there's an accountability for leaders in an organization, and there's also self-accountability for how am I investing in my own development to become aware of my biases, to become aware of how I treat others, and to help ensure pipelines and help ensure that everyone that I interact with in any given day in my organization feels included and valued in how I approach them. And I go back, right? People will remember how you made them feel. And so this study is fascinating. And for me, the more I thought about it, the more I thought about we need to change the way we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion today. There are multiple dimensions for us to consider. We have spent so many years talking about the right side of this diagram, individual and programs. We've spent so many years focusing on how we can fix people problems and how we can fix each other as people, eliminate our biases, treat each other better, have higher emotional intelligence, have more inclusive conversations. Absolutely, yes. We need to continue to do that. We need to continue to develop and learn new things and explore new topics. And in our organizations and in everything that we do, we also need to think about how the systems and processes that we are building impact our diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, personally, for our teams, and organizationally. And what I mean by that is when I was in graduate school, I read a book and took a course with a professor at MIT called Ed Schein, and he studied organizational culture. And he fascinated me, his concepts of culture. He said that culture is not just values and behaviors. Culture is also the systems and processes and the way you work and the way you interact with each other. So for example, if you believe that you have an inclusive culture in your organization and all of your employee engagement surveys come back, oh yes, we feel included here. And then you do a deep dive assessment and you look at how you're managing performance and you're looking at the conversations that leaders are having with their employees and you're tracking who's promoted in your organization. You're asking different types of questions about, do you feel like you can be your full self here? How are we supporting that you can be your full self here at work? All of a sudden, we find that the way that we assess performance, the ways that we provide feedback, the feelings that people get after having a feedback conversation with their leader and their boss, those aren't equitable. Those don't feel inclusive. So values and behaviors are one thing, but the systems and processes, the way we do our work, If those do not support the values and the behaviors, then we're not inclusive at all. We're not equitable at all. And so when we think about diversity and inclusion and we think about what we do, we also need to think about how we do it. In a world that is becoming increasingly digital, and yes, that's not going to go away, where we are all virtually connected, we need to be able to assess how artificial intelligence, our systems and our processes, and that work of our workflow, how everything interconnects across our organizational ecosystems, impacts our culture, impacts how we feel, and impacts diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we need to look at this holistically from an organizational perspective, from an individual perspective, from a systems perspective, and then from a programs perspective. So programs to help leaders learn and thrive, to inspire others through storytelling, through book clubs, through formal learning and informal learning. And also from an organizational perspective, from a systems perspective, from a process perspective, from a transparency and culture perspective. All of it is the multiple dimensions of DEI that we need to consider in order to be able to lead this work. And this happens in our families and in our societies as well. We talk about privilege, we talk about systemic advantages. What that means is that built into a system, built into a process is an experience. And some people, that process, that system can give advantages to a certain population. So as an organization and as leaders, as individuals, we need to consistently be thinking about how am I showing up and how is what I am doing and how I am doing it having an impact on others? Is it equitable? Did I just build a leadership development program that no matter how many times I promote it, it only appeals to a fraction of my employee population? No matter how many times I try to give opportunities to a particular person on my team, this person is not engaged or interested. Is it because I'm thinking about these opportunities and I haven't asked them specifically about what it is that they want to do? Is it because the way in which they have to register, the way in which I have set it up, it may cost too much money and that person is too embarrassed to tell me that? So again, it's individuals and programs and organizations and systems. And this is the multiple dimensionality of DEI that so often we forget to think of from a very global and macro perspective. Tomorrow, we're going to be focusing so much more on the individual and on the programs. For the rest of our time here today, Tina and I are going to be focusing on the organization and the systemic ways in which within our organizations we can create change, especially for marginalized groups who are experiencing so many disadvantages currently in our workplaces. So not long ago, I was reading a blog on medium.com by this woman who goes by Chris, and she wrote an article called Belonging, a conversation about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And she shared this diagram, which I thought was fascinating, and I wanted to share it with all of you here today and have a global conversation about this. Well, thinking of diversity, we often think, what biodiversity? What does that mean? A variety of living organisms in a particular habitat or ecosystem. This is what we find in nature. How is it different in our organizations? The term of diversity between people is fairly easy to understand, right? It's the presence of difference. That's simple. And we can refer to people of various races, genders, socioeconomic status, all of that we just discussed when we defined the terms. But when applied to an organization, defining diversity needs to include diversity of ideas, so cognitive diversity, cultural diversity, right? And also how all of the different pieces fit together. So what she was saying is that if all of these exist in an organization, right, inclusion, equity, belonging, and diversity, the perfect place in the Venn diagram of all of these interconnected spots is belonging, right? All of them come together, and all of them, diversity, equity, and inclusion, lead to a feeling of belonging in our organizations. We're an org that engages full potential of the individual, where innovation thrives and views, beliefs, and values are integrated. Think for a moment about your organization, about your team. Are you in that spot, right in the middle of that Venn diagram? And if you're not, several things might be happening. So what she says is that in many organizations, we can be diverse and not particularly inclusive and equitable. We can be inclusive and not diverse. We can be equitable and not diverse and inclusive. But if we don't have all three, we're not going to be in that spot where we want to be. So how can organizations prioritize a balance between all of them? What this diagram also shows us is that if we are inclusive and diverse, but not equitable, you may have the dominant group or ideology that is deferred to for decision-making, opportunities, and promotions. So you might have, without that proper balance, an oversaturation of inclusion and diversity and a lack of equity can create its own challenges in an organization. Same for if you're equitable and inclusive, but not diverse. You might have an oversaturation of similarity, homogeneous culture, and simplified points of view that aren't diverse. So if you look across the diagram and all of the different formulas here, the important piece to take away from this is that we need to be all of these things. We need to think of all of these points. Because if we are just one of them, in many or in most organizations, we focus deeply and we go deeply in one space to say, okay, this is a priority. We need to be more inclusive. But if we are inclusive and we're not diverse, then what are we inclusive of? If we're diverse and inclusive and we're not equitable, then does everybody have the experience that they need to feel that they fully belong, that they're supported, that they're psychologically safe, and that they can do their best work? So again, these concepts are all interwoven. And when we think about our impact, what we can do as individuals and organizations, what we can do for those of us that are leading organizations is have these types of conversations to assess and be more and more aware of where and how we can invest. And this doesn't mean that we need to invest in all of these at the same time. But we need to be able to build plans, strategic plans that say, if we are this now, where are we now and where do we want to be? And to get to that space where we want to be, where are we going to need to invest and at what time are we going to need to invest? If we try to invest in all of them together at once, we run the risk of oversimplifying it. We run the risk of not being able to meet our goals and objectives. We run the risk of change not being sustainable and scalable. And so the goal of this work is not to look at these as separate entities that need to be managed differently. It's to look at them as interwoven, but also to look at all of this work as a journey. It's not just one destination. It's not a finite point in time. Any of us are going to be perfect as this. If we go back to this diagram about all of the multiple dimensions, again, at the top is the organization and the individual. And organizations and individuals are on journeys for diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we are constantly trying to evolve and shift and change, have growth mindsets, and keep that pace, but constantly assessing, are we there? Are we good? Chances are we'll never be there. But the goal is to make that journey as strategic and sustainable and scalable as possible. And each and every one of us as individuals and each and every one of our organizations are at a different place in our journeys. So many times when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we talk about maturity models, right? So how mature is your organization in these concepts? How inclusive, equitable, diverse? Do you have a culture of belonging? How mature is the organization? I believe that maturity models will soon be a thing of the past, and we're going to be talking about these journeys the evolution of DEI in our organizations, and how every day we learn something new about ourselves in an interaction that we have, in a project that we initiate that did not go the way we wanted it to, but we learned a lot from that process. It's how we bounce back, it's how we rebuild, and we keep going and we keep having these conversations with the idea that every day there's something new to learn and there's always a way to improve and do more of this. So strategic planning, thinking strategically about where you want to be, when you want to be there, and realistically planning for how you can do that. If you are not a diverse organization, but you're inclusive, your top priority should be, how can I recruit diverse talent? How can I invite women back? How can I promote women and equip women to empower women in the workplace to be able to reach higher levels? How can I do that for Black, Indigenous, people of color in my organization? How can I do that for LGBTQ plus members of my organization? Do I know who they are? Do they feel comfortable enough to share those pieces of their identity? So if diversity needs to be a priority, invest in talent. Invest in the acquisition and development of talent. If equity is a priority because people are not being promoted, they're not advancing, they're not being compensated equitably, and organizations need to look at themselves honestly and assess that constantly, then how do we make sure to bring in either an outside perspective, to take apart all of the ways in which we collect that data, in which we assess that data, in which we have performance conversations, and to change that conversation so we can become more equitable. So first step is assessing it, and the second step is prioritizing what's next for your organization, what's next for your team, what are those goals, and how are you going to get there? So the next piece here, as I wrap up, is what are the top priorities that we as leaders need to be thinking about when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, when we think about building strong pipelines of talent, when we think about how to increase engagement, productivity, and innovation in our organizations. So there's 3 pillars. The first, leadership, best practice, and advice that I have is we need to democratize it. What do I mean by democratize it? Yes, leaders, executive leaders, senior leaders, frontline leaders, leaders across the organization need to be engaged and supportive of this work. And this is an effort. There is not one person that owns, even if you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion head of that in an organization, and I'm sure Tina will share this as well. That person doesn't own DEI for the organization. They are not solely responsible for its success. We all are. So democratizing the experience, empowering others. If you're leading this work, if you're talking about this work, if you're leading a book club in your organization, do you have the confidence and comfort and experience and development and learning to be able to do so? There's a very fine line between empowerment and tokenism. And what do I mean by that? It's easy for us to say, build employee advisory groups, employee resource groups in our organizations and say, okay, we've done it. We now have a group of people and some leaders in the organization who are invested in the advancement of this particular group. That's a relatively easy program that we can put in place in our organization. We can empower them even. We can give them some money. Or in many organizations, we don't give them any money, but we empower them to be able to to create events, to bring in guest speakers, to have different sessions, and to support each other as members of that community. But as organizations, we need to be very careful that we don't say to these groups that are invested in this work, okay, you're invested in this work. Now you find solutions to all of the problems that your particular community is facing. So as organizational leaders and as organizations and as maybe individuals who are leading some of these groups and this work in our organizations, we need to be aware that there is that fine line between empowering me and creating a token out of me in this work. So it's asking the question, it's investing, it's making sure that responsibility and visibility lives in multiple places in an organization. Democratizing it, making sure that this is talked about across our employee ecosystems, across our different channels, that this has tentacles that touch all parts of an organization is so important. Investing in the leadership development of people who are leading this work, whether they're executive sponsors, whether they're employees who make up an inclusion council, whether there's some sort of governing body in your organization or not, we need to invest in the development of our leaders to be able to explore our implicit biases, to be able to build leadership competencies of empathy, of inclusive leadership, to be able to build our allyship, to shred the baggage and all of the perceptions that we have that reinforce those biases. Leadership development is key to being able to build a culture of shared ownership for DEI in any team, in any organization, in any structure where there are people who have more power than others. And lastly, in order to be able to do that, we need to be able to invest in executive partnership and sponsorship. This type of work needs to have a voice at the main table, a seat at the table. And we cannot operate with the assumption that because someone is an executive leader, they automatically, organically, and instinctively know how to do this and how to lead this. So investing in the leadership development of executive sponsors is also important. At Skillsoft, we have an inclusion council that is made up of employees from around the world who have a vested interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organization. They advise our executives, and we have an executive sponsor who takes what they're advising, who takes their work and is able to speak about it at the executive level and be an advocate and a champion for this work. In addition, we have employee advisory groups. We call them EAGs at Skillsoft, and we have co-chairs, and we have executive sponsors for each of those advisory groups. But one thing that I insisted upon is that before we even get started on this work, all inclusion council members, all executive sponsors, all of the co-chairs go through a learning and development experience with a facilitator and a coach to empower them and help them to feel comfortable and for them to explore their own biases, for them to understand and do this exercise that we just did. What is diversity? What is equity? What is inclusion? What is belonging? So to empower everyone to fully democratize the experience and to remove the levels in the organization, levels of power in the organization, especially around this work, so that we all convey that we're all on this learning journey, regardless of the level of our role in the organization. The next recommendation that I have for leading DEI for impact is to socialize it. And this is where we do our best learning. When DEI becomes a social initiative, a social experience for us, we do our best learning. What do we know about adults? Right? Adults, we need to learn what we need to learn when we need to learn it quickly. Most of us don't have time to invest, right, in 4-hour trainings. However, some of those experiences can be the most transformational. So socializing this work means leading a global discussion, making sure that we focus on the why first. Why is this important in our organization? What is the purpose? Why are we doing this? One of the first charters for our Inclusion Council at Skillsoft was to write a purpose statement for this work that we share internally, that we have everyone's collective buy-in. This is what is important to us, and this is why it's important to us. Focusing on that why provides each and every one of us with an anchor. There are many leaders who are leading teams who are doing this as well, who are saying, this is why this is important to me, and I need your help in helping me get there. So focus on the why first. Leverage the 70-20-10 rule. How many of you know what the 70-20-10 rule is? For those of you that don't know, if you do, chat it in the chat pod here. The 70-20-10 rule is that as adult learners, we learn 70% of what we learn through experience. 20% of what we learn and adopt, we learn through social interaction. And 10% of what we learn and adopt, we learn through formal training. So all of us that work in learning organizations know that if that's the case, our training programs need to be experiential first and foremost. But let's sit with that for a moment. Socializing it. 70% of what we learn and are able to adopt, we learn from experiences. 20% from social interactions that we have with each other, and 10% from a formal educational environment. That means that we absorb the most, we change the most, we transform the most as humans when we experience something firsthand. So how do we do that? In organizations, we shy away from having global discussion forums. We shy away from having these conversations because they're uncomfortable. We don't know if we have the right language. We don't know if we could be offending someone. We have to be careful, yes, of micro behaviors, microaggressions, statements that we make that could offend someone and could close the conversation. But if we create a space where people can come and feel safe to share their stories and their experiences and know that there won't be any negative repercussions for them, a space where you have executive involvement and they're not the speakers, but they're the listeners, you would be amazed at how transformational that type of an experience can be for people. And I can share in my own experience, having led global discussion forums in the middle of social unrest and racial tension in the United States. And it was an opportunity in a virtual live setting for executives to sit and listen to the experiences and the feelings of the employees in their organization as their communities were going through such turmoil and disruption. And I sat, and as the facilitator, I opened the floor for people to share their stories and their experiences. And it was powerful. And executives walked away from that saying, wow, I never knew that this was the case. And employees walked away from that thinking, wow, I never knew that this was the case. I didn't know this about my colleagues. I need to be more sensitive to this. So whether you're a leader and you do a listening tour, whether you're an executive leader and you do skip level meetings, the 70-20-10 rule teaches us that those experiences matter, and that embracing storytelling and inviting it and bringing voices in and empowering diverse voices is a key part to making sure that we'll have an impact and that we can scale and sustain this work. Because those of us that are leading these efforts in our organizations, we're not going to be here forever doing it. So it needs to be built into the fabric of the organization and in every single individual in order for there to be an impact. So democratize it, socialize it, and iterate on it. We need to audit our biases regularly. Again, if we look at that diagram as individuals, and again, if we have brains, we have bias. It's completely natural. But what we do with those biases and how quickly we overcome them, that's what we need to do and strive for. And also the biases that exist intrinsically in our organizational and our social cultures, right? An organization, if we believe that an organization is a living, breathing entity that is always evolving, and it's made up of all of these different ecosystems that are all connected and interwoven with each other, then inherent in that ecosystem and that structure, there are bound to be biases, right? Think of all of those organizations that have cultural pillars or values like intensity, integrity, bold. How many of you work in organizations where you have cultural pillars or words or values? Do you evaluate boldness? Do you evaluate integrity? Do you evaluate intensity? Whatever those values are, the same way for all people in the organization? Or is there an inherent bias that a certain way of demonstrating those qualities is a better way to do it and gets more visibility and more leadership and access to opportunities? And so audit our biases regularly and be honest with ourselves. What exists and how do we need to change it? I once participated in a hack lab, run by former hackers, computer hackers. And they showed this whole diagram in this hack lab of how do I hack someone's computer? And it was fascinating because they took it from the perspective of how do you make something better? How do you keep iterating on something and asking yourself the question of, can I do this? Am I there yet? So if we take everything that we do and assess it, am I there yet? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, how do I break it down? How do I audit these biases? Now that I know that these biases exist, how do I fix them? And to constantly iterate on that journey. Practice extreme listening. That is a concept that came up in an interview. I don't know how many of you know Simon Sinek, who wrote the book Start With Why and also Leaders Eat Last. So he had a podcast and he talked about what it means to have extreme listening tours in an organization or to practice extreme listening. Extreme listening, as he defined it, is, and it was as it was defined in the podcast, is this notion of we are able to listen and just be fully present and not be thinking of our answers and not be thinking of what we're going to say next or ask next. It is to ask a question, sit present, and listen. Just listen to what the other person is saying. Ask clarifying questions and just listen. And so listening tours, again, whether they're skip levels that executives are working on, or it's you going out and saying, I don't know this person enough. I have to work very closely with this person on a project, and I don't know what their motivations are, their goals are, who they are, what's important to them. Ask questions and listen. And then finally, this work is exhausting and it's hard. And all of us are suffering the effects of disruption, grief, loss in our world, in our communities, and in our families. And so we can't do this work without acknowledging the tremendous toll that all of us have felt, many of us more than others, this past year and a half, throughout our lives, depending on how we identify. All of this work is hard and it's challenging. And there are days where we feel great hope and there are days where we feel great challenge. And so we can't do this ourselves as leaders, as people, without investing in our wellness, without investing in our resilience, without putting our own oxygen masks on first in order to do this work. And this is important, and I know Tina would share this, and any leader in this space would share this. The idea of putting your own oxygen mask first in an airplane before you can put it on others applies to leadership broadly, applies to diversity, equity, and inclusion work very much so. We need to be able to take care of ourselves in order to take care of others. And so we need to give ourselves permission to do so. And when we see that there are others around us who are feeling taxed and burdened, to help lighten that and invest and commit and help them invest in their wellness as well. And if we're leaders of teams and leaders of others, this is so important. Part of recognizing our humanity, part of ensuring that we can do this work is investing in each other's wellness and supporting that, supporting flexibility, listening, asking what's going on in people's lives, practicing empathy as much as possible, and making sure to stay connected. Those fundamental human principles, because remember, again, this is business work and this is human work. And DEI needs to be able to speak to the heads and the hearts of our employees and our leaders. This isn't just one-dimensional, it's multidimensional. So if I could wrap up with one lesson that I've learned that I want to share with all of you before I hand it over to Tina, who will take a deep dive into some numbers and what this looks like when we bring it to life in our organizations. We need to be able to think big, think globally, think broadly, think across all intersectional points in our ecosystems. Who do I interact with? Who are my stakeholders? What is my ultimate goal? What is it that I want to be able to achieve on my team, in my organization? And how do I get there? How do I inspire and how do I influence in the areas where I can, where I have control, where I have influence? And we need to start smart. It's really important that when we do this work, we don't try to boil the ocean. Remember the Venn diagram, right? What am I lacking and where do I need to invest? Don't boil the ocean. Start smart, start strategically, start with assessment. What is most important? What do I need to build? What are the gaps? And based on those gaps, what is going to be the smartest place for me to start in a way that is scalable and sustainable, and in a way where I don't overcommit to myself or to others? Because what happens when we are reactive and where we say, oh my goodness, you know, we will be celebrating Pride in exactly 2 weeks, we need to pull something together. How that is perceived by members of the community, even though we have the best of intentions, is that they are an afterthought. So start smart, plan. And if that means starting small and starting with the micro, that is okay, as long as you have that macro lens that is always your goal. And pause often. There will be times throughout our journeys where we do not feel, and we know, or we've received feedback that we haven't done something right, that this is a bit off, that this doesn't feel right to everybody. That's okay. We need to be able to practice a pause. Where am I going? Let me do a pulse check. How am I feeling? How are others feeling? Does this make the most strategic sense for me, for my team, for my organization? Pause, regroup, and determine whether this is a moment where you need to pivot or this is a moment where you need to persevere. And don't let yourself be the only litmus test, the only test for making that decision. Again, there's not just one person who's responsible for this. This is a collective experience. So ask others, bring others into the conversation, enable a moment of pause for your team members so that you can have these conversations, collect, and again, determine, can I pivot or persevere? And there is no time like the present to get started and having these conversations and planning. Again, this pandemic has devastated us in many ways, and it has also provided us with new, renewed focus and visibility into this work, in new passion and new purpose. So if we can harness that energy and apply it to have an impact, right now is a great time to do that. I've often said that this pandemic will serve us, if we look at it, as one of the greatest leadership development opportunities that we have had in our lifetime, to be able to empathize and support and inspire and care for others as we need to. So the business case and the human case. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tina to share her slides and her beliefs and her leadership on how organizations, specifically her organization, ThoughtWorks, are bringing these concepts to life in some very real ways. Tina, over to you. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for providing such deep insights into what DEI is in the context of the workplace and the impact of the pandemic. I think the mechanisms and recommendations to integrate DEI practices in all aspects of the business and the benefits it brings, I think, has been beautifully covered. So in the short time that I will talk about a holistic approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, what I would do is talk in relation to some of the things that we've done at ThoughtWorks. And I will also share a couple of examples and post that in the Q&A. I'm hoping to answer some of the questions that have been shared so far. Right. So for those who don't know, ThoughtWorks is a global software consultancy and a community of passionate, purpose-led individuals. So we are 8,000 people across 48 offices in 17 countries. So diversity exists by default, right? If you're talking about 17 countries, if you're talking about 48 offices, it's very inbuilt into diversity is very inbuilt into the business that we are, into the clients we service, the people that we are, and our culture itself. I think one of the other unique aspects of ThoughtWorks is also the fact that social change and our vision for social change is integrated into our DEI agenda. And this has been something that's fundamental to who we are, right from very early on when we started ThoughtWorks about 26, 27 years back. So as technologists, we have a unique role to play in ensuring technology benefits all of society. And so we really want to be reflective of the world that we live in and the community that we serve. So that is a little bit around ThoughtWorks. I head the DEI agenda for ThoughtWorks in India and global as well. And I work with a diverse group of people across ThoughtWorks and the industry at large externally as well. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here talking to all of you all. Moving on. Like I just told you all, diversity, equity, and inclusion, we truly believe have the power to create transformative social change. And so it's very, very important to have this message go out in every aspect of the business that we do, right? Right from our clients to the people who are interested in being part of ThoughtWorks, to the people who are part of ThoughtWorks, and to the society at large. And I think over the years, this has been inbuilt into every aspect of the business that that we are in. So one of the key aspects of how we look at DEI is that we reject discrimination and inequality and promote diversity in all its forms. And so to do this, there is a particular set of practices that we have, a set of agenda that we have, and a goal that we have. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So a lot of that, what I'm going to share is here in this particular slide is my personal thoughts and views, but also a little bit around how I look at DEI in ThoughtWorks itself, right? The reality is diversity exists in society, right? Whether as an organization you want to invest in it or not, there is diversity in our society that is reflected in the people that we hire and is reflected in our workplaces. Our lived experiences are different. I mean, Elisa has touched upon it beautifully. Each one of us have our unique identities, and there is intersectionality as well. So whether you care about it or not, and want to invest in it as an organization, leaders need to know that diversity exists, and they need to work with this diversity to be able to be a successful business, to grow, to innovate, and to also build a culture that is sustainable forever, right? Inclusion, according to us, is an organizational capacity. When we look at organizational capability, it cuts across multiple aspects, multiple dimensions, like your people policies, like how do you sensitize and build awareness amongst people? What are your recruitment best practices? It cuts across things like your employer brand, how inclusive and what is the story your employer brand is telling? How do you insist on working with diversity along with your clients? The partnerships that you have, who do you support? Some of the external organizations that you work with, all of this is inbuilt into your inclusion agenda. Equity is leveling the playing field. We all know that we don't start at the same place. Everyone starts differently. I mean, even if you just say gender equity in the workplace, a place where a woman in urban India starts, for example, and a person and a woman in rural India starts, irrespective of whether they're working for the same organization or not, is very, very different. Our identities are different. Our lived experiences are different. The privileges that we've had are different, right? If you're a woman of color, or if you come from an indigenous community, the privileges that you've had or not had differ. And hence, it's very, very important to level the playing field. And I'll share some agenda and initiatives that we have in terms of leveling the playing field at ThoughtWorks. Belonging is safe, authentic connections. When I talk about authentic connections, it's about how do I feel, right? How safe do I feel to question and challenge authority in my workplace, right? It is about how can I bring my whole self to work? It is about how accepted I am. It is about how microaggressions is questioned and challenged in the workplace. It is about questioning our unconscious biases. And all of this comes together, and an amalgamation of all of this is what will build a truly diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace. And I will quickly share some examples as well of some of the things that we do to ensure some of these things. I have to call out that diversity, equity, inclusion is always a work in progress. It's never a state, it's always a journey. And there are so many aspects that needs to be touched upon that sometimes you may go wrong, sometimes you may go back, you may go ahead, or you may pivot and say, hey, I'm going to take a different stance. I'm going to move in a different direction to support a particular community or an underrepresented group. But what is very, very important is collective ownership and a unified purpose to do this. And I think those are the things that will matter the most, especially in the context of where we are today and how much of disparities is there in the workplace due to the pandemic. Moving on. Elisa spoke about metrics, and she spoke about why it is important, to have metrics. One of the things I think historically ThoughtWorks has focused on is women and underrepresented gender minorities in technology. The reality is women and underrepresented gender minorities are have very, very low representation in the tech industry. And as a technology organization, this is an area that we want to invest in. So ThoughtWorks aims to be 40% women and underrepresented gender minorities in tech roles by 2022. When we say technology roles, what we define as technology roles is those who are active in the creation of software that we build and who amplify the technology support that we provide. Currently, we are roughly about 37.46%, and the pandemic has only been a lot more challenging in helping us achieve our goals. But this is what it means, right? A holistic approach. The way we look at it is right from your employer brand to your recruiting strategy, to the people support that you have, to your policies, to advancement opportunities, to your retention strategy. All of this goes into making us achieve this goal. A lot of times when organizations look at having a goal, many times it's always about, oh, what is the numbers that we are recruiting? How many people are joining us? They don't look at the advancement piece of it, and nor is there a lot of focus that is there to retention. And that is where metrics come in. One of the things that we do is that we constantly are monitoring our DEI metrics at ThoughtWorks. So this is done via quarterly reports that we submit to the leadership teams, both at the regional and at the global level. We have a global DEI council that is helmed with key stakeholders being our CEO and our head of people, and multiple people from the global leadership team as part of it. There are DEI representatives and also representatives from the underrepresented communities as part of this. Now, this DEI council sets the strategic agenda and is someone that we go back to if we need support to pursue and push some of our DEI goals and agenda. Like Elisa mentioned, leadership commitment and the governance body is key in helping driving your DEI strategy with a futuristic vision. You can't really not have the support from the top, right? Your leaders need to have bought into your DEI purpose and vision. It needs to come from the top, but there needs to be participation from people across multiple aspects of the business. Because if DEI is not a collective ownership that cuts across all aspects of your business, then it will not be a success in your organization. Like I said, be agile, be open to change, to pivoting, be open to feedback. There are so many times when we've looked at a particular initiative and said, hey, this is something that is so beautiful, works for us. This is set in stone. I don't think that we can change what we're doing right now. Well, the pandemic has been eye-opening in so many ways. We have an initiative called Vapasi, where we offer free technical training to women who've taken a break from technology and who are finding it difficult to get back. Now, why do these women take a break? Right? Most of the times when we've done a research, we've seen a pattern. Women anywhere between 6+ years of experience or 5+ years of experience at an average to 10 years of experience are quitting tech, primarily because they are the key caregivers for their children or for elderly people in their families. Women's income is seen as disposable income in many families. And they are, because of the role of the primary caregiver that they play, a lot of times the break that they take makes it difficult to get back. Especially in the tech industry, this is very, very challenging because technology is going through constant change. And hence, this program that we designed, which is a 4-week technical training program for women and developers, and a 3-week technical training program for quality analysts, women, was where we started off pre-pandemic. And the program was running beautifully. We had women who joined us through the program. Not only was it a training program, but it also offered internship for some of the women who were part of the program. Now, when we did this program face-to-face, we had a lot of support from ThoughtWorkers. We had trainers from ThoughtWorks. We had a lot of people who were invested in this, and the women used to come out of their homes and be in a place where they could 100% focus on this program. Now, during the pandemic, we really had to pivot because we couldn't run the program most of 2020. But towards the end of 2020, we said, how does this situation change? It's only impacting women a lot more. We see a lot more women leave the workplace due to the pandemic, and also, the attrition rates had increased across the tech industry. And so we made this program, increased it by a week, and started doing this program virtually. We found a way to deliver laptops to all of the participants. We found a way to run this program for 6 hours in a day, because we realized that many of the women who were part of the program will not be able to devote 8 hours in a day when we used to do this program face-to-face. So we increased the duration of the program. We had a lot more thought workers invest in being mentors during this program. So that is, roughly, an example of why it's important to pivot, to change, to look at whether this initiative is working. What do we need to do to improve? And as always, collective ownership and building a culture of safety and trust is something that needs to be just inbuilt into your organizational culture and workplace, which means that you need to feel safe to say that, hey, for this particular reason, I'm sorry, I can't be part of this project. I don't see diversity in my team. I don't see how you are supporting me in my advancement journey. I don't see how, pay parity is something that exists across the board in the organization. To be able to openly question authority, to be able to openly question your leadership team. When I say authority, it may sound very hierarchical, but the reality is that many of us carry this mindset that we can't really question the leadership of the organization. So a lot of it is about how approachable your leadership is and how do you, you support them. I see that there is, a question around, what is underrepresented gender minorities. So underrepresented gender minorities are people who are non-binary and gender queer. So if you see that there are a lot of people who are non-binary folks who do not, who are not, actively there, especially in the white-collared industries and organizations. So I think that is something that we invest in and focus on primarily as well. Moving on. So if you look at the 4 areas that we focus on to bring in a holistic approach to DEI in the workplace, the first one is, and not in any particular order, but just want to call that out in the slide, is find and nurture diverse talent. Like I said, there are particularly initiatives that we have in place, and I've just shared some examples below, which is 40% women and underrepresented gender minorities by 2022. In addition to that, we also have a regional focus of underrepresented groups. And this is something that we encourage our offices across the region to have, right? If you're in Australia, your indigenous tribes will be underrepresented in tech. If you're in the US or in North America, you would see that there is an underrepresentation of people of color, the Latinx, people from the Asian community. So if you're particularly in a country like Brazil, Black people and people with disability, but people with disability cut across all of the regions, and the representation is very low. So the basic ask for regions is, in addition to having this 40% women and UGM goal, to also have an additional goal that your regions can work on. And this can be decided based on a decision that you can make collectively. And so you would find a lot of thought workers involved and very happily participating in this, because they personally identify with this underrepresented group that is specific to their region as well. We also ensure that inclusive hiring practices are inbuilt into our overall strategy, our talent strategy, right? So you would see that we have something called the culture round as part of our interviews, and this is a round that we have across for everybody who joins us. Now you would see that as part of this culture round, we talk about why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to us as a business, sharing some of the initiatives that we have, sharing the goals that we have, how we monitor metrics, having open conversations around how, as a diverse organization, you probably will be working very closely with people from the LGBTQ plus community. And unless you are accepting of the community, this organization may not be the right place for you. It is also a dialogue. It's not necessarily an interview, to understand, what the candidate, how the candidate cares about DEI in the context of the workplace, their lived experiences. Simple things like how gender neutral are your job descriptions? How do you ensure your panel is diverse in nature, especially when you're interviewing someone from an underrepresented group? How do you ensure accessibility support is provided to people from, so that the disability community understands that they're being supported? So a lot of times, as part of a hiring process itself, we ask a couple of questions so that, the underrepresented communities are supported through the interview process itself. Now, when you look at inclusion and belonging, there is a lot that you can do under this umbrella. Right from sensitization and building awareness about underrepresented groups, unconscious bias trainings that you can have. You can also talk about mental health and wellness in the workplace. We also talk about inclusion best practices embedded into our onboarding process itself, right? So you have, as part of our onboarding, we have a session on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We talk about the code of conduct that we have globally. We talk about how it's important to create a safe space. We talk about, and there's a lot of storytelling, right? A lot of times when you do not have storytelling built into, into your DEI strategy, a lot is lost in translation. So it's very, very important that you have people who share their stories, their lived experiences, but also offer a safe space for them to do that. And also remember that the more we share, the more we build a culture of inclusion and belonging in our workplaces. So, there is training, there is anti-discrimination, and many of our policies are gender neutral, including a prevention of sexual harassment in the workplace. Because the reality is anyone can be sexually harassed in the workplace, and it doesn't have to be gender specific, although we do realize that a certain gender has been, historically, you see a lot more cases of sexual harassment that women had to face, or the LGBTQ plus community had to face in the workplace, right? And then we also have globally celebrations that we decide on, whether it is at the regional level, we celebrate multiculturally, right? Whether it is festivals, or whether it is days, whether it is specific initiatives or programs specific to an underrepresented group. But globally, we also, for example, March is the Women's History Month, and we ensure we amplify some of the things that are happening globally. Because when you spread across so many regions, you realize that there is uniqueness to a lot of things that we do at a regional level. So offering a platform to share some of the initiatives that we have, and the storytelling also matters. Next month is the Pride Month. We realize also, and we acknowledge that in countries like India, Brazil, Ecuador, the pandemic has, continues. A lot of people are dying. And hence, it is very, very, very important to acknowledge that. So the June will be called the LGBTQ plus Observance Month, where we will talk a lot more about allyship. The reality is also that whenever there is a crisis, the underrepresented groups are the ones, and the marginalized groups are the most impacted. And with this acknowledgement, we try and provide the right support, not only internally, but we also offer support externally as well. For example, in our India office, one of the things that we have done is we've asked all of the employees that they can take 1 hour to support any external initiative in terms of pandemic relief. And this can be clubbed into, for example, 4 hours in a month as well. And so many thought workers have availed, this offer that's been given, and have been supporting external groups as well. Mental health and wellness, I think, has been amplified so much, but the more, we talk about it in the context of a huge collective, it is lost. So we are trying to see how we can bring, mental health and wellness conversations at the team level. We're also helping our program managers, our project managers, to understand that leading through uncertainty is very important, and how can they equip themselves to lead through uncertainty. Moving on, in terms of advancement and opportunities, you would see that, there's a lot that we do in the advancement and opportunity space. I'll just move to the previous slide, Akansha. So there is like I said, right, it's not only about hiring, it is not only about retention, but it's also about, as an underrepresented group or a marginalized group, how are you supporting me as I advance my career? So we track everything right from what is the representation that we have at the global leadership level, at the, of WUGM, at the global leadership level, at the India level, and then by grades, by, some of our senior most grades, so that the right support is offered, pay parity checks. All of this is something that we look at. We have a program called Women in Leadership Development. The acronym is WILD. And we have more than 50+ percentage of WUGM as part of this program. And this program can be plugged into any of our leadership development programs, or offered as an exclusive program as well. In terms of retention and people policies, I think, like I just mentioned, pay equity reviews, fair opportunities for internal roles and advancement, leadership opportunities, proactive retention strategies, right? Why are people leaving us? Why do we not see advancement in this particular group or community? What type of supportive policies can we have? Especially, flexible workplace policies has existed in the last many years in ThoughtWorks, but I think Many organizations have had to relook at the flexible workplace policies, the parental support that is required, all of that in the context of the pandemic today. But overall, I think for us, this holistic, four-pronged approach has helped and worked very well. But the overarching thing for all of this is the right governance, is leadership support, and is collective ownership from across all levels of the organization. Moving on. ThoughtWorks has been recognized globally for a lot of things that we have done, a lot of awards that we won in the DEI workspace, right from initiatives that we've had. But we know that we still have a very, very long way to go. There, we constantly do something called the DEI survey on an annual basis in ThoughtWorks. There's a lot of feedback that we receive from thought workers when we run this global survey. So the survey touches upon engagement, it touches upon diversity, equity, and inclusion best practices, and it cuts across demographic information as well. So when we look at the data, we can actually slice and dice the data by groups, by grades, by roles, by years that the person has spent in the organization or years of experience. And this slicing and dicing of data really helps us offer a very customized lens to what type of initiatives and programs and support that we need to plan for the coming year. So overall, this has been our approach, and like I said, right, this is never a state but a journey. And over the years, I think one of the critical things that has worked for us is having people invested in DEI. Right, each region needs to at least have a person 50% at a minimum in the head of DEI role. Having regional councils help, having this person be part of the leadership team really helps in pushing the agenda across your multiple functions, right? Whether it is your accounts, whether it is your client initiatives, whether it is your hiring, retention, people initiatives, whether it is how your brand is projected via marketing. So being able to have that holistic approach, I think, will really help. So
thank you. Thank you so much, Tina. Thank you for sharing your insight with us. And thank you, Alyssa, too, for your really insightful workshop at the beginning. So both of you have created a lot of a lot of thought for conversation here, a lot of comments coming, a lot of things in the chat, many questions also for the both of you. So I'd like to start with the Q&A session, I think, for the both of you. So I have around 60 questions or more here in the chat section. I would request you also to kind of go through them and see, is there anything that you particularly want to pick up and answer? Or is there something that I should just, kind of present, ask you directly? So in the Q&A,
so
yes.
One comment I saw there in the chat pod was, Tina, while you were speaking, a question of what does LGBTQIA+ stand for? And that brings up such an interesting question about the importance that as we are building these global programs, we're also very sensitive to regional diversity and cultural diversity that exists in different parts of the world. So I will say that LGBTQIA+ is an acronym that is used in certain parts of the world to define and to provide a framework around the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, and asexual, plus many others who identify as members of that community. There are many acronyms that are used in different parts of the world. This is one that is the most inclusive and used most frequently, also LGBTQ+, which you heard me reference. But again, it brings up that interesting piece, Tina, about regional diversity, regional awareness. Since someone asked that question while you were speaking, I just have a question for you. Do you have any recommendations for organizations? And I see that coming up also in the chat pod here, how to have that global perspective, but also regional sensitivity and awareness?
Yeah, I think, when I look at DEI itself, a lot of times organizations focus on the D and I and miss out the E. miss out equitable strategy, and the fact that, it's never a level playing field. And that is something that we need to call out, especially because of the intersectionality that exists, and also because of the unique identities that each one carries and the lived experiences of each one of us. So, when I talk about culturally diverse, right? Um, I, I think historical discrimination and patriarchy and the way each region has dealt with it differs even from country to country, right? So if you look at some of the European countries, it's a lot more equitable from a gender standpoint. But when you look at some Southeast Asian and Asian countries, there's still a long way to go. If you look at domains and industries, so if you look at, for example, the tech industry, you would see that there's a lot of progress made. But if you look at, for example, the manufacturing industry, or you look at the shipping and cargo industry, or if you look at the financial services industry, there is lesser representation and probably lesser focus, because lesser representation inadvertently means that there's lesser focus as well. So yes, cultural context matters a lot. I can tell you, even in the pandemic, right? When I looked at, for example, when the pandemic started, it almost seemed like a level playing field, right? Everyone's going through the same thing. But in the second wave, we've realized that the inequity that exists because of lack of medical support, the lack of medical facilities in developing countries like India, Brazil, or Ecuador, has thrown up that inequity so much. Also, the reality that affordability of vaccinations, right? Vaccines, being able to, so being able to afford vaccines for all of your, the people in your country, who has access to it, who doesn't. And there is this nonprofit that's running vaccination drives. And the reality is, in India, you see a lot more younger people, being impacted by COVID. A lot of the younger people, they're losing younger people. And that inequity exists. So being able to use a cultural and a gender lens, when we're looking at these multiple aspects, which is one of the reasons why in ThoughtWorks we've said, yes, women and underrepresented gender minorities is important, but from a regional aspect, you focus on one area that, or an underrepresented group that you want to invest in. So there is that intersection of a global goal with a regional goal as well. For example, in India, we decided that we would invest in LGBTQ plus inclusion. And as I talk, we are running something called the Interning with Pride program. And we have promoted this program, and we are running a free internship, 4-month internship for people from the LGBTQ plus community. And we have people who have worked with us across. Now, it's also important that you have the right partners, right? Many of us are not aware of these inequities, of what the actual problem is these marginalized groups face. So being able to tie up with external partners who are thought leaders in this space, who've done a lot of work and invested a lot of effort in understanding the space, right? And what exactly this community needs is very, very important. And through our journey on LGBTQ plus inclusion, for example, we have partnered with organizations like Solidarity Foundation, like Periphery, and to be able to understand, or Pride Circle, to understand, what the community needs and how we can provide the right support. And so that has worked very well for us.
Great, thank you. Since we're discussing a lot of equity and equality, and I'll come back to the beginning when Elisa, you had started speaking, and there's a question that came up from Kavita saying that the difference between equality and equity is often misinterpreted. How do you suggest we make this difference clear within the organization? And also, there's an added question to that I'd like to ask. It's about who decides who needs help the most. Do we have any established best practices or industry standards to apply equity to the workplace? So I'd like to kind of merge these two questions. And Elisa, if you'd like to take this up.
I will. I'll start, and then Tina, I welcome anything that you'd like to add to what I state here. So the first part of the question is how to have a conversation around and educate the difference between equity and equality. It's educational. it's communication, it's getting the word out and having this getting the word out across the organization, and helping leaders with the terminology and with the definition. The way we started today is the way we need to start these conversations in our organizations, which is defining what these concepts mean and demystifying them. And, I think that especially when we think about equipping executive leaders to support these messages, we can't just have the expectation that they will. We need to be able to equip and enable our executive leaders to speak and to themselves know what the different pieces are, what they mean, and how to do that. So for me, it's educational at all levels in the organization. I know that I've delivered many training programs, discussion forums. There are many images on the internet, if you Google equity versus equality, that show, I think, really, even in my son's school here in the United States, they study this. And I don't know how many of you have seen the image, but it's an image of 3 children watching a soccer, or in many parts of the world, football game, right? And so there's a fence, and they're all trying to look over the fence, and there's a tall child, a medium-sized child, and a small child. And the image is that equality is a equal size box for each of the children to see over the fence. But what happens, right? The tall child standing on the same box as the shorter child, he or she is still going to see over the fence, and the shorter child is still disadvantaged. And so then the image is, well, equity is being able to provide each of the children a box that enables them to see over the fence. And therefore, the shorter child has the largest box. And then there's an additional step, which is, well, why not remove the fence altogether? And so there's those types of images, those types of analogies can serve as an educational purpose. What we teach our children in our schools, we need to hear and we need to learn from each other as adults. And who determines, right? Our communities determine, people determine. The data that we see surrounding us determines that. It's not a secret that women have been impacted by this global pandemic. Women of color have been impacted even more so around the world from an economic and a social perspective. There's no secret around this evidence and this data. There's no secret that in the United States, we are struggling with racial violence and tension and so much unrest around either our Asian and Pacific Islander community as a result of the pandemic, and more broadly, and all of the historical context and trauma that we have for people of color in the United States, for indigenous populations in other parts of the world, for different, so it really, the data is out there. And the communities exist in our organizations. If we give them a voice, we know who in our organization, we look at our pipelines and our diverse talent, we know who we need to prioritize and who we need to bring in, if for no other reason to reflect the stakeholders that we have in our ecosystems, right? How many organizations are not able to be successful in their market because the people who are creating their products, the people who are leading their organization, do not reflect their customers and reflect populations in their stakeholder groups. So that, I think, is my response to those first 2 questions. Also, we need to be able to ask those questions in our organizations and listen for those answers to determine where to focus. Tina, anything you wanted to add to that?
Now, probably another example, I spoke to you all about the Interning with Pride program. Now, inequity exists even within the LGBT community, right? LGBTQ plus community. So when we did the program last time round, we had direct applicants, but there was no one from the transgender community. And so when we did the program again this time, we realized there was no one from the transgender community that was applying. And what we realized was that the community has been ostracized, and and they haven't had the opportunity many a times to go through the educational requirements and the interview process that most tech organizations need, right? Either self-learned. So what we did was we partnered with an organization that works specifically in the trans space and told them, hey, you have 3 months, pick your, do an application process, because they're likely to come and feel like they won't be judged directly if you'll reach out through your database and network. And we will, support y'all, and we will pay for y'all to prepare them for the ThoughtWorks interview. And so there is this organization that we partnered with that is actually training, trans people so that they are ready to be interviewed by ThoughtWorks. So the reality is we don't start from the same place. It's not a level playing field, like I just said. And so if we do not have specific initiatives, you will never have marginalized, underrepresented groups in your organization. And that is a reality. And it's very important to track this metrics. Many regions, this metrics is tracked because legally, from a compliance standpoint, you need to track it. Sometimes employees give this information because they know that, there will be, supports that's offered. So these are optional set of questions that you could have as part of your demographics when you go in and do a survey, or in your people profile informations in your HRMS tools. But most times people share this information. Also, a lot is visible to the eye, right? If you are an underrepresented group, we see that. And most people from underrepresented groups want to see more people like them in the organization so that they feel safe. So I think there is, so I am a really strong believer that metrics and goals are important, but at the same time, that's not the only thing that's important, because a holistic approach needs to be followed.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, Alyssa, for the wonderful analogy. Thanks, Tina, for adding on the organizational element to that. I am seeing a lot of questions again of how do you set DEI goals in an organization? If you're reorganizing your, restructuring your organization, how do you set those goals? Who's responsible? Who's not? How do you put the whole process into place? So I think that would be a great, something that everybody would want to know here. So Alyssa and Tina, whoever would want to take that first.
Alyssa, would you like to go first, and I can follow up?
Sure. So again, this is shared responsibility. What we're seeing in many organizations, however, is that creating a role where there is a figurehead, where there is someone who can facilitate the conversation, support leadership development, help build in a strategy, communicate that, and orchestrate all of the different parts and pieces and stakeholders and owners of this work across an organization is an effective way to get started. Again, I go back to my comment about the difference in the fine line between empowerment and tokenism. We're finding, though, that many organizations that have someone at the level of an executive, someone who reports to senior executives, who can focus on this work and who has the resources, can really create sustainable and drive sustainable change in an organization. I also go back to this democratizing it concept that we talked about and that Tina shared examples of. That is so very important to make sure that we're bringing together the collective voices in an organization and moving it forward. The exercise that we did at Skillsoft with our Inclusion Council was to ask ourselves a question: what are our top 3 priorities for the year? That are tactical, and what is the ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve this year? And we tied all of that into the strategic planning of the organization that happened at the leadership level, right? And talent planning as well. So what are the 3 things that we want to be able to focus on? And we determined that we wanted to focus on our culture internally, building our capability first and foremost. And we would do that, right? So that was our main goal for the year. And we wanted to do that before we looked at supplier diversity, before we looked at all of the different ways that we could branch out. And then we focused on 3 pillars that would help us get there. So the purpose statement that I mentioned, investing in our employee advisory groups, and then also building a global awareness campaign that helped us celebrate, acknowledge, commemorate those moments, those events, those days, those months, like Women's History Month, Black History Month, Pride Month, all of those moments that we need to celebrate in different ways around the world. And so, again, being very clear and specific about who you're empowering to make these decisions, where your advocates live and your sponsors live in the organization, and having this be a fully transparent and global conversation. Tina?
I was just looking at something that Graham mentioned in the chat where he said it's interesting that the trans people needed the training and not the organization. Just wanted to clarify, Graham, that sensitization right from our security folks to the people who are the trainers, to specific training, to participants of the training, to the mentors, is something that by default happens in ThoughtWorks, not necessarily something that happens only during Pride Month or during the program. So the sensitization happens through the year, and that is something that we think is extremely critical, because the reality is that only a very small percentage of the LGBTQ plus community are out, and when many of them are in the closet and they need the support, and many of them have come out based on the support that has been provided. So yeah, so just wanted to call that out. So going back to now I forgot the question. What was it?
How do you set the right processes, the goals for DNI?
Yeah. So a lot of organization, I mean, a lot of folks, have reached out to me personally and said, Tina, we are part of this affinity group, and leadership is not willing to make the right investments in DEI. And I tell them, always present how this is going to impact your business, like innovation, and how your business will grow, how it will improve your retention strategy, because retention is a big problem organizations are facing today, right? So talk about that first. Talk about your industry examples. Talk about your competitors, what your competitors are doing in the DEI space, and then bring it down to what your people are saying. Because that's a reality. If your leadership team is not bought into a holistic approach to your DEI agenda, then if the people on the ground, your affinity groups, your people-driven communities care about it, the only way to get your leadership buy-in is also to talk about what your competition is doing in this space. How does it impact your business growth, just your numbers and overall retention and culture of the organization? And there are n number of examples and stories. Today we talk so much. I think the last 4 to 5 years, there's been so much progress made in the DEI space, right from research, reports, stories organizations are sharing, communities that are built, as well as initiatives that are there, as well as partnerships that exist, right? So really, there is no excuse today.
Great. Thank you so much. I think I have time just for one final question, and it's about the uncertain times that we're living in and how it has impacted the overall workplace. So, how does the gig economy, since that's become a very popular concept now, gig economy and all the weakening social contract between employers and employees impact the DEI agenda in organizations? I think that's a very important question, since a lot of people are now working in that model. So, Alyssa, Tina, maybe you would like to start first, and Alyssa would add to that. Yeah.
ThoughtWorks is a consulting business. So if you look at many of our, our regions, like the North America, traveling to your client site Monday to Thursday night or Friday, is something as seen as normal. And the pandemic really made us challenge some of these thinkings, right? Is it really important? So from a flexible work standpoint and what we have to offer, I think, like I said in my presentation, right, it's important to address, pivot, look at what changes that you need to make. And I think there is going to be a lot of changes. I think everything that we have said, right? So if your clients belong in the financial services sector, we talk about security, but we've been able to deliver working from home with the same level and probably amplified level of security, things that we've not explored before. That the pandemic made us explore every possible, way of making working from home possible. So I think, yes, there will be a lot more people who probably will work part-time, will be working for multiple organizations. But I really, truly wish that, personally, that the gig economy wouldn't really pick up, because there's so much from a cultural standpoint that you hold dear when you are part of one organization, and the support system that you can provide. But like I said, right, irrespective of the industry you're in, irrespective of who you are, what you do, ethnicity, group, diversity, anything, you should be accepted for what you want to do and who you are. So if you want to work part-time, if you want to work split your time between multiple organizations. If you decide that as someone who, as a parent, I want to work 50% of my time and 50% I want to be a working dad, so be it. I think today we need to acknowledge that, and we need to accept and embrace that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, Alyssa.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina. I want to just speak about this from two lenses before we wrap. The first is cultural, as Tina had said. So we form cultural and social contracts with everyone in our company, not just full-time employees, and everyone that is within our ecosystem. And so our customers are watching, our shareholders are watching, our suppliers are watching, not just our employees. So regardless of whether the people working for us are contractors, temp employees, full-time employees, part-time employees, remote, in a building, this work matters to anyone who is in a relationship with our organization, right? Regardless of whether or not they are contractors or not. From a talent perspective, I think that the gig economy offers us an opportunity to be very strategic about diversity and to bring in diversity of thought and perspective and experience that is project specific so that we have bursts of ideas and innovation in our organization. So we're seeing many organizations now are being thoughtful and creative about how they can leverage individuals who are taking advantage of this, who need to, either they've been laid off and now they're part of a flex work program, or they're doing some consulting, and thoughtful about how they can bring diversity into an organization in diverse ways that nurture the different ways in which people have to work today. So it provides us with an opportunity, but also a sense of awareness that we're not just talking about full-time employees here. A company, we call companies for a reason. It's because we enjoy being in the company of others. And that is the lifeblood of an organization. And so regardless of how you touch the organization, this work matters. And I think that this allows us, these new trends around the gig economy and gig roles, allows us an opportunity to expand the conversation.
Absolutely agree with you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alyssa. Thank you, Tina. That was all the time we had. Sadly, we had so many questions, so many comments coming in. Wish you could have had the time to take them all. But thank you so much, everyone, for being so proactive and interactive all through the session that we had today. So on that note, it's time to wrap up. I think, yes, DEI are no longer considered nice to haves, especially during these uncertain times. Reinforcing robust DEI programs helps every employee to show up each day without the fear of being their true selves. I think that's what is most important. So thank you so much. And it does, foster higher degree of engagement, productivity, innovation, and overall contributes to increased revenue. So on that note, thank you once again, everyone. It was a very, very insightful session. And I'm sure all of us will reflect on the learnings that we have once we go back to our workplaces. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, Tina, for the wonderful insights. And a special thanks to Tina for taking out time for schedule to help us with this thought-provoking ideas. And Alyssa, thank you so much once again. It's post midnight for you there, but thank you so much for keeping awake and sharing such great insights with us. It was a great, great session today.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you once again. So before we wrap up again, I would like to remind you to engage with us on the platform, introduce yourself to everyone, share your expectations from the session. Section 2 has the details of the pre-reads. You can go to them once again. For those who have not received their login credentials, please email to the address provided and we'll get in touch with you. We are looking forward to seeing you tomorrow on the second day of our virtual leader camp on the topic embracing allyship and lead inclusively. The timing for the session remains the same. Tomorrow we'll be hosting a panel discussion with leaders from Johnson & Johnson, Manpower Group, and Amazon Web Services, sharing some great and interesting examples and cases. So do join us tomorrow once again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And with this, we are going to end this session. Have a great day ahead. Stay safe, everyone, and take care.